Content creation is becoming more and more of a popular hobby as time goes by. With this, however, is the false assumption that you need a powerful PC to make content. This is primarily led by large streamers who often have powerful rigs to play every game on the market. Today, I will show you that you don't need a good computer to start recording games, and we will go through setup as well as game benchmarks. You can begin making content on something as simple as an old home office computer with some light upgrades. The computer I have chosen for this video is an 11-year-old Dell Optiplex 3020. This has an Intel Core i5-4590, which is a Haswell CPU with 4 cores and threads, running at 3.3 GHz. It has 8 GB of DDR3 memory, as well as an SSD for quick loading times of games. It also has an upgraded graphics card, which is a GTX 960. This came out 10 years ago and features 2 GB of video memory. If you already have your own system, it would cost roughly $40 to upgrade it with a similar graphics card. Or to buy a computer from scratch, it would cost around $300 for roughly the same or better performance as this example PC. You can also go with something less powerful, but for compatibility, going with at least Intel 4th Gen or AMD Ryzen will ensure things such as the Adobe Suite will run properly. Also, having 4 cores will help games run with less stutters when recording, although higher core counts are always better. On the graphics side, you should have something dedicated, no integrated graphics, that supports at least DirectX 12 for all modern games to launch, as well as hardware encoding to help take strain off the processor when recording or streaming games. Due to its SSD and somewhat modern processor, this computer is already pretty quick at general browsing, though gaming will be much more demanding, so we need to optimize some OBS settings first. Start by opening OBS, then clicking the Settings button in the lower right corner. From there, click on the Video tab. Set the canvas resolution to 1920 by 1080, or whatever the resolution of your monitor is. Set the scaled resolution to 1920 by 1080 as well. Set the frame rate to 60 frames per second. One important thing to remember about the FPS is that if the game isn't a multiple of your OBS FPS, the frames won't line up and your video will be stuttery. For this reason, make sure to lock games to a multiple of your OBS frame rate. If your card can't manage this FPS, try decreasing the OBS frame rate to 30 and locking the game to 30 FPS as well. This will look smoother than having a higher frame rate that isn't a multiple of OBS. Then, click on the Output tab with the Streaming subsection. Change the output mode from Simple to Advanced. Change the video encode from X264 to NVIDIA NVENC H264. Set the bitrate to 6000 kilobits per second, or whatever your internet can handle. I don't suggest going above this for 1080p, as it is plenty for clear quality video. Change the preset to slowest and set the B-frames to 4. Also, set multipass mode to full resolution and the keyframe interval to 2 seconds. Move over to the recording subsection and change it to all the same values, except set rate control to QP with a QP value of 23. This is a good starting point, and seems to work well for the GTX 960 in this system. Depending on the card, however, you may have to set these settings differently. A good place to start is decreasing the preset to a faster setting, although you may have to spend some time fiddling with it. It's also important to remember that every game will run differently, so for each game its graphical settings and OBS may need to be tweaked to have things run smoothly. Prioritizing FPS over graphical quality is also important as viewers prefer to have a smoother experience. Now, let's move on to some examples with real-world games. We will separate this into 3 categories: easy-to-run games, old AAA games, and new AAA games, with each having a few entries to show how the example system performs. Let's first start with some older but still popular games. The first game on this list is Minecraft, which the system runs flawlessly. Capture is possible at 60 frames per second 1440p, and even in large servers it still runs smoothly. Here's some footage of me playing the TNT game mode on Hypixel. When loading chunks, the game does have large stutters, although this happens on most computers and is more a fault of the game than the specific system. Switching to the Sodium renderer did help cut back on the stutters largely, however they were still present. When not loading chunks though, the game runs extremely smoothly. Terraria also runs well at 1440p 60 FPS unsurprisingly, which makes sense given it runs on even toasters relatively well. I wanted to push the performance of the system, so I loaded up modded Terraria with a large amount of add-ons. Even with this, the system still recorded smoothly until I spawned in a billion bosses, then it started struggling a bit. However, in most normal use cases, Terraria runs exceptionally well. Older source games like Garry's Mod will also be a piece of cake for this system, and you can max out the settings at 1440p and still have a premium recording or streaming experience. I suspect this also carries over to all games built on the Source 1 engine, like Half-Life, Portal 1 and 2, Counter-Strike Source, and TF2, although this one is less optimized nowadays. I finalized with Don't Starve, which as expected ran fine at 1440p. With most older games, cranking up the settings to 1440p or even 4K at high settings is completely doable with this system, and I suspect this logic can be applied to any game pre-2012, except maybe Crysis. Next, I moved on to some easier to run AAA games and newer indie games. The first game I tried was Devour, which is much newer than the games previously tested, having been released in 2021. This game was a bit weird with the frame rate, but eventually settled down to a pretty constant 60 FPS at 1080p high settings. Even during moments of heavy action, the lowest drops I saw were 50 frames per second. I then moved on to Deceit, which is a really fun detective-themed game, sort of like Among Us. I was expecting this to push the system a lot more, as there is a larger player count as well as the maps being pretty large. However, the system ran this at a stable 60 frames per second when recording, albeit with a mixture of medium and lower settings at 1080p. I was curious how the system would run modern competitive games, so I moved on to CS2, which is probably one of the easier ones to run. The computer ran this perfectly fine with mostly lower settings and a 1080p resolution. I wanted to run at a capped 120 frames per second, although it wasn't able to reach this target most of the time, so I capped the frame rate to 60. If desiring a more competitive experience, the frame rate could be uncapped, although this would lead to less smooth recording or stream, as it seemed to fluctuate a lot between 90 and 100 FPS. I'm sure the frame rate will vary depending on the map as well, and I did all of my testing on Anubis for reference. Finally, it is time to push this system to its absolute maximum with some more demanding AAA games and new releases. I started with the Finals, which I ran with all the settings on their lowest and a resolution scale of about 70% at 1080p. While the system was able to achieve close to 60 frames per second when not streaming, as soon as I fired up the stream, this number dropped closer to 30 frames per second. Unfortunately, while this is still a manageable figure for streaming, 30 FPS makes it extremely challenging to be competitive in a first-person shooter game, so it's most likely a game to avoid with this type of system, as your viewers will probably make fun of how bad you are at the game. Things got even worse with Still Wakes the Deep, which is a game that released in 2023 on the new Unreal 5 engine. I set all settings to the absolute lowest, with a resolution of 720p and FSR in performance mode with frame gen enabled. Even with these settings, the game still ran comically poorly and had a very stuttery frame rate ranging from 20 to 40 frames per second. It also looked like a PlayStation 1 game, and I could barely tell what I was seeing. I suspect this type of performance will be similar for most games built on Unreal Engine 5, although some games like the Finals may run better with this system. However, low settings and a 30 frame per second target are a best case scenario for these games. Ending on a positive note, I fired up Stray, which ran very well at medium settings with a resolution scale of 90% at 1080p. This allowed the game to almost always run at a consistent 60 frames per second, with good visual quality and smooth frame times. This heartening result shows that some newer AAA games will still play nice with this system, depending on how they are optimized. Another aspect of content creation is editing footage. This computer can edit 1080p content using Premiere Pro and Photoshop with no issues at all, though due to having only 8GB of memory, most background applications must be closed. Besides this, while things aren't as fast as a modern computer, everything is still pretty responsive and perfectly serviceable. While this computer might not be able to stream every game perfectly, it can still handle almost all old games and a good portion of new games very smoothly. Additionally, when it comes to content creation, graphics quality is only a small part of it, and the biggest factor is the person behind the computer doing the commentary and gameplay. Because of this, don't limit yourself if your hardware isn't the best. Focus on what you can run and making that a good experience to watch. With that note, thank you for watching, good luck recording or streaming, and have a nice day.